Chapter 2 Into the Jungle. Our eyes heavy with sleep, we waited in the Santos Dumont Airport. Our departures were usually characterized by last-minute longings, and this one was no exception. We clinked our coffee cups, toasting the success of our adventure, and smiled at each other. If a rather apprehensive feeling passed over us momentarily, we made light of it. It was cold, contrary to what one would expect in a warm season. But we had had practical experience, and our warm clothing, three-quarter-length boots, lined leather lumber jackets, and balaclavas made us feel only temporarily uncomfortable, out of place. Surrounded as we were by elegantly dressed passengers bound for the interior. We had hardly entered the fuselage of the Air Force D-6 when we came to the conclusion that our foresight had been justified. Originally, these planes were intended for the parachute corps. They had no bulkhead frames on the crosstrees and beams, and no vestige of comfort that might entail extra weight. There were two long wooden benches at the sides of the fuselage, and the padded freight was distributed down the center and in part of the tail and fastened with strong cords. The plane was full. The dawn light was trying to penetrate thick black clouds when we started off down the runway, and in a few seconds we were swaying into the air. Hardly had the plane gained height when we proved once more that the tropics are earthbound. The cold was lord and master inside that machine, and its occupants, with the exception of ourselves, huddled up and tried to keep warm in their inappropriately light clothing. When it came to means of locomotion, we, especially my wife, had always preferred anything to traveling by air. We considered that airplanes were machines that were liable to get out of man's control, with disastrous consequences. But this happened to be the only means of reaching our objective. We had not long left the Atlantic seaboard behind when the jungle exerted its hegemony, shared from time to time with lazy rivers, shining reddish mountain ridges, or extensive deserts in which stuck up clusters of emaciated trees. We got the impression that the aeroplane was dawdling over the jungle, but we were cruising at nearly 160 miles an hour. We had not long left Guez, the capital of the state, which bears the same name, in unsettled weather when the storm broke. The sky became a dark leaden gray, and a dense squall enveloped us completely. This was certainly a tropical trend, but not one which met with our approbation. Thunder and lightning succeeded each other incessantly, and the plane rocked and jerked against a curtain of water, plunging and swaying in a most unpleasant manner. The first flash of lightning that struck the plane was nothing much. There was a dull impact, and the machine shuddered from stem to stern. The passengers, quite until that moment, now set all conventionalism aside. At the first cry of a woman, there appeared crucifixes, rosaries, and little ivory hands dangling from chains. Prayers and lamentations almost drowned the storm. Observing such reactions made us forget the dangers ourselves, even though 2 or 3 times I did squeeze Norma's hand, but she did not need any consolation. On the contrary, she was trying to console the others. The storm became even more severe, and emergency bags were handed round quickly, into which the faces of almost all the passengers disappeared. They withdrew them only to utter a cry, a prayer, or a complaint. Fortunately, their stomachs proved more exigent than their inclination to express themselves orally, and thereby worse panic was avoided. We flew through endless hours of this agony. Especially did it seem painful to us, for it seemed that after so much effort all our work would come to nothing, through some undreamt of accident. A name which a man shouted electrified the passengers. Cerros Azules, the Blue Hills, he had yelled. This was immediately followed by general hysteria, more lamentations, and signs of the cross. As we found out afterwards, there was something obvious implied by this exclamation. The pilot could not count on sufficient visibility to land at Barra do Garças, a small hamlet in diamond-bearing center which was surrounded by rugged hills with lofty peaks which he must now fly over. If the plane could not make sufficient height, we did not care to think about that. The crew were manipulating the cords that held the freight in check. They were waiting for the pilot's order to jettison the cargo in case we could not gain enough altitude. We had been flying in the center of the storm for 3 hours, and we knew that the efforts which the engines had been making to keep the plane pushing against the wind had almost emptied the petrol tanks. The only thing left to do was to land at Xavantina. Whether there was visibility or not, the consequences would be the same anyway if we did not. Then unexpectedly we saw it, and an intensely hot flush crept over our bodies. A cloud bank opened up, and as if through an incredibly crystalline eye, we had a clear view of a stretch of jungle. Soon the clouds spaced out, and we could see in all its magnificence the stout, compact greenness of the jungle, a river of milky white waters, and thousands of palm trees forming a great curve. The river widened as it kept us company on our journey onward. It was the river of death. A little farther, and then the undercarriage was lowered for landing, and we were told we were Xavantina, 1,800 kilometers, 1,100 miles from Rio de Janeiro. The passengers who disembarked there after a flight of 13 hours seemed apathetic to their surroundings. The reason varied from person to person, but we ourselves were also in that state. There was no doubt that we were no enthusiasts of aerial navigation, but we observed the locality greedily. It was a dependency of the foundation of Central Brazil, an institution which is creating new settlements in the vast and still almost unexplored panorama of the Brazilian interior. There was a large landing field for military aircraft, of which a daily visual inspection had to be made to prevent catastrophe being caused by cubes, mounds of extremely hard soil formed by termites, often reaching a height of 6 feet. There were 2 neat buildings of bricks and tiles made on the spot. One housed the radio station and Xavantina's proudest possession, a paraffin refrigerator which contained nothing but ice cubes and water. The other was the billet of the Air Force radio operators. Without guiding radio beams, air transports would be the playthings of the optical illusions created by the eternal green of the jungle. A shed containing petrol tanks was the only other thing that we saw. There was the jungle again, with low undergrowth surrounding with its lush arm the area of the reddish landing ground, just waiting for man to relax his vigilance to trespass immediately upon what had been won by fire and machete. The jeep which drove us towards the hamlet was one of the things that had been brought by air. Shaking and rattling, and at a dizzy speed, it plunged along an undulating road full of potholes in the midst of a cloud of red dust that made us sneeze and caused our noses to smart. The planning of Xavantina was the fruit of the ingenuity of men in Rio de Janeiro. It was intended to be the beginning of a great township, which indeed is bound to exist eventually, although I am somewhat skeptical as to the number of years it will take. 2 blocks of grassland formed the main square, and around this were a chapel and a few houses with a wholesome whitewashed appearance and tiled roofs. And I would add ungrudgingly that they were really pleasant to look at, which surprised me. We stopped in front of a well-cared-for house just as the rain began. It was the dwelling where the president of the foundation of Central Brazil came to stay from time to time. He was quite a VIP with powers hardly less than those of a minister of state. Nevertheless, the lizards appeared to make no distinction between this and other houses, for they scuttled away in all directions as we went in. Next day, in contrast to the day before, a blazing sun lit up the confined perimeter of Xavantina. with a terrible glare, serving as a belt on the western side and providing the habitations with water, flowed the turbulent river of death. It was swollen as a result of the recent rainy spell. The crashing sound of those turbid waters reached me distinctly, and seemed like a warning to us that this was no ordinary river. The inoffensive watercourse concealed the invisible line that separated the known from the unknown. So well did the river of death define that sensation that to cross it towards the west brought with it immediate peril of death, for one was then, in fact, entering Zavant territory in which there was no guarantee of safety for civilized man. We had a great deal to do sorting out and getting ready what we had brought with us, since some of the equipment was to be left in Zavantina, and above all, finding someone expert and willing to conduct us downriver. However, we continued to sit over breakfast. The atmosphere of the place was making itself felt, and we did not care to drive away that strangely pleasing experience. An hour's stroll around the hamlet told us many things. The climate was overpowering, and walking under a sun that irradiated 122 Fahrenheit was no pastime. We came into contact with tiny flies which we had met before, but which were no less troublesome for that. Hardly had we left the benefit of the shade behind us when they besieged us, getting in our eyes and biting any part of the body not covered by clothing. Their bite was not very painful, and if one did not touch it, the smarting passed off in a few minutes. But if one made the mistake of scratching, then the diminutive swelling spread and the itching became intolerable. The people who lived in that town numbered some 60 souls, and for the most part were a product of that natural mingling of black and white so common in Brazil. Only their poverty and ignorance had made them accept work in territories where civilized man was a stranger in the fullest sense of the word. Apparently these simple, affable people succumbed easily to superstition which was intimately bound up with their lives. They assured us that the route down the river was closed because the Zavant parent village was decked in war paint, that the Zavants no longer respected the river frontier, but on the contrary, war parties had been crossing it in belligerent mood. This news, as well as other tales, was confirmed by gossip among the settlers, but I had a notion that it was all pure fantasy. I increased the sum of money I had offered for the canoe trip. The new offer met with sullen silence. When I insisted further, they broke up and moved away, somewhat dispirited because in Rio de Janeiro they had assured us that the trip was practicable. We returned to our lodgings rather fed up. But in expeditions of this kind there is no time to feel sorry for oneself. Perspiration was pouring down our shirts, and a good bath was in order to offset this disappointment, and to enable us to adapt ourselves better to a depressing and exceptionally torrid climate. The afternoon brought us no consolation as we conveyed our problems to the boss. Yes, he had a 10-horsepower outboard motor and all the fuel we would need, but if he lent them to us, what guarantee was there we would ever come back, and who was going to take us anyway? His logic was irrefutable. As the afternoon faded among ridges of clouds on the horizon, and the changing colors mingled the hues of purple and violet, profound reflection robbed us of the pleasure of meditating upon the mystery of nightfall. All our longings, efforts, and preparations were halted, but as this was only the first day of our stay, we could not complain. We were well aware of everything that was important about Zavantina, and most important of all, that the Zavant chief had his village only a few miles from this hamlet. He was known throughout Brazil. His notoriety dated from some 14 years before, when as a simple warrior of the parent tribe he had helped to spear and kill the 7 members of the service for the protection of the Indians, including Dr. Pimentel, Barboza, whose name was given to a place of interest on the Rio das Mortes. His goings-on were always marked by death and deceit, and he lacked the loyal and valiant spirit of the Zavant warrior. His character, alien to his tribal heritage, enabled him to stimulate friendship with the white man so as to obtain gifts. The success from the point of view of the civilized of this friendship with the then Zavant captain was remarkable enough for the Brazilian press to regard it as a great achievement. The government intervened, and through the intermediary of the Service for the Protection of the Indian and the Air Force, an attempt was made to introduce him to Rio de Janeiro. The numerous deaths that he had on his conscience were mere incidentals to the Zavant character. That was the official pronouncement, and for once they were not wrong, since in effect that is just what such killings are in the Zavant warlike incursions. When, with some misgivings, they got him to enter an aircraft for the purpose of making a short trip to test his reactions, he took it with absolute calm. He was not surprised at anything, and showed a courteous interest in what was explained to him through an interpreter. 2 days later, and for the first time, a Zavant captain accompanied by an escort left for Rio de Janeiro. However, once inside the plane, the roles were reversed. It was no savage marveling in ecstasy at what he saw, who sat there so stiffly in one of the seats, but a person who evinced a sardonic disdain at the display of interest and uneasiness on the part of the crew. He asked only one question as they flew over the coast: if the white man could travel like the birds and in great canoes, can he also travel underneath the ground? He was surprised when the answer was no. To the puzzlement of the civilized, Rio did not arrest his attention either, and he accepted it naturally as being a village of the white man. They took him to a classic Carioca football match to impress him with the crowd and to gain more respect towards white men, and tell of their power to the undisputed chief of the Zavants in the parent village. They conducted him to the center of the field, where he was given a tremendous ovation and a fireman's helmet. They pointed out to him how vast the white tribe was, and that it was not good to be at war with it. His only answer was, "This is the white man's land, mine is the Zavant's." When he returned to the tribe, he committed a grave error. He tried to give himself airs before the legendary chief of the parent tribe, who feared and respected throughout the state of Mato Grosso, banished him from the village. Irubuina, as this captain was called, left the parent tribe and had the bad luck to run up against another captain who was an enemy of his. He killed him treacherously and carried off the 2 wives who were accompanying him. As a result of this act, he had been exiled from Zavant territory. To approach it meant instant death for him, and that indeed is what happened in May 1958, when he was speared to death together with his wives and children, and 2 other captains by warriors of the parent village. At the time of the visit, Irubuina had crossed the river of death and established himself for convenience beside Savantina. At first, the anxiety of the settlers was without foundation. They began a series of thefts and plunder of small farms by Zavants. In April 1956, when we were in Savantina, the settlers were taking their wives to the town and equipped themselves with arms and ammunition, for it was feared there might be an unfortunate incident. They knew that once that happened, the Zavants would not stop till they had exterminated them all. Irubuina and his people were subsisting prosperously on the settlers' plantations, and they were shielded from the main tribe by being within the limits appointed by the Zavants themselves. Our taste for oranges and bananas, which were very scarce, led us by chance to find out about a conspiracy. It was found preferable to trade them at Barra do Garza, where there was plenty of money. So, ironically, the ancient derelict plantations of those bandeirantes from Sao Paulo, who in former times had settled there in search of gold and diamonds, were depended upon. With very little labor, it had been found possible to make the orange groves and banana trees produce abundantly. The banana thus grown was known as the banana da terra, and was useless unless it was fried or boiled. In our predilection for fruit, we initiated a friendly arrangement with the settlers, which later turned into support and advice. The Sertanero settler is extremely simple, and he regards anyone who comes from Rio and brings equipment which is strange to him as a superior person. One evening, as we went into a hut, we suddenly found ourselves enveloped in the smoke of a dozen rompeto, chest-busting cigarettes made from the tobacco they use in the interior, in the midst of settlers carrying Colt 45s and belts full of cartridges, who had plans and ideas about undertaking a punitive mission into Irabuena Zavant village. Whether they did anything apart from bringing some oranges and bananas, I do not know, but we advised prudence and calm until the Service for the Protection of the Indians should intervene. The agent or headman of the settlers was known as the boss, and later he came to see us. We talked of the zone, of Rio de Janeiro, and of ourselves. Above all, I told him what I had come to look for. The boss suspected, as did many others, that what attracted us was gold, diamonds, or some mineral substance of great value in connection with atomic experiments. My explanation that I was an anthropologist meant nothing whatever to him. Amidst the swatting of beetles, and my difficulty with Portuguese, and the boss's slowness in understanding me, I finally gathered that this visit was not so much a courtesy call as interest in some boxes of cigars I had. When I offered him one, he threw away the weed he was smoking, and suddenly sprang the news on me that there was another motor in the shed belonging to a Salesian missionary who was due to arrive now, that the dry weather was setting in. If I had a little patience, the missionary would have no objection to taking us, since we were headed the same way and our interest coincided. The satisfaction which this news afforded made me a little incautious. Unthinkingly, I opened the box of cigars again, and saw 5 large, new, fine-quality Havanas disappear into the boss's pocket. Then forthwith he left us. Obviously he had delayed his information purposely to give me an opportunity of offering those blessed cigars. That night found us without pressing problems. Having got our material ready, enjoying the fresh air and the millions of stars, which, in the absolute blackness of the night, seemed to have multiplied in number and brilliance. Very often enthusiasm for a cause, or the interest awakened by contact with unfamiliar things, makes us unwary. Thus it was that we partook freely of the food peculiar to the interior of Brazil. Its basis is simple: rice and black beans, to which is added jerked beef, game of some kind, and a piquant condiment made with chilies, paprika, and black pepper. This condiment, which would have delighted a Spanish conquistador, was added to the soup, always of vermicelli, or even to the eggs. Only the dessert escaped, because there wasn't any. When we got up from one of those meals, we felt as if there was heavy artillery in our mouths, and there was a really unpleasant fire raging in our stomachs. Without giving warning, our systems were resenting this treatment, and one day we were overcome by a persistent laxness that robbed us of all energy and caused us to feel worn out, even after a short stroll. We attributed this to the climate or to the water. We protected ourselves against the heat, and we took appropriate measures to counteract a possible intestinal infection, increasing our ration of salt, but the indisposition did not pass off. At last we tried refusing the food and cooking the provisions we had brought with us for the jungle. We recovered immediately, only to suffer like a pair of misers at having to use our treasured foodstuffs in a populated area which was well stocked with provisions. From the first moment, one spirit became allied to various things peculiar to Xavantina, the restless little electric green lizards which scampered across the ceilings of the house, the friendly cooing of the pigeons in the nearby balta bushes, the cadence of the stream gliding over pebbly soil. We would wake up in the morning amid friendly sounds. As was our custom, the first thing we did was to open a window made of board so as to let in the light. We always did so carefully and with the aid of a match or flashlight, because tarantulas abound and had been found in most unexpected places. So when Norma stifled a cry, I thought a spider had settled on the bolt of the window. It was, however, no spider. The head and part of the shoulders and chest of an Indian were leaning against the partly opened window, and he was contemplating us unblinkingly. His appearance was impressive, especially as he neither smiled nor spoke. He observed us gravely and remained completely motionless. Norma, more practical than I, and guided by the warnings of the locals, looked sideways to make sure that the bathing trunks were still hanging outside where she had put them the night before. The Indian had not moved. He resembled a statue in old bronze. Only his black eyes were alive. When I tried to talk to him, he turned on his heels and walked hotly away, his long hair swinging about his muscular back. He was the first savant we had seen, and his appearance could not be more typical of a nomadic warrior hunter. The dry weather settled in, the river was dropping, and an islet that had been half hidden by the water was now visible. Overnight, nature had displayed extraordinary vigor. Thousands of yellow blossoms covered the river banks, and the low vegetation in the depressions of the ground and in natural basins stagnant water was imprisoned. The ideal breeding ground of the mosquito. Unfortunately, the Anopheles, the malaria carrier, was among the numerous varieties. The sun, which nurtured the land, was now draining it of every trace of moisture, later to split and impoverish it. We took a dose of anti-malaria pills and mounted the small, gawky nags which the friendly settlers had placed at our disposal. The way to force the body to adapt itself to the toughness of life in the Mato Grosso and make it shed its slackness and lethargy was to exercise it to stimulate perspiration and eliminate the toxins, and to eat well. It was an infallible method, and the only one we could follow while killing time waiting for the missionary. Against the well-meaning advice of the settlers, we decided to devote a day to paying a visit to the tribe of Irabuena. The path was narrow and the vegetation dense and low. It was a tough land with a brutal climate, and with no large trees or giant forest. On the contrary, the jungle stronghold consisted of stunted, tangled flora, and of brambles and twisted bushes. There was a feeling of solitude. Birds were few, and the verdure confined to some clumps of shrubs and prickly palms. Away from the river, the soil appeared to be of a reddish clay, mingled with sandstone. Before we got sight of the Indian huts, we could smell their location by the smoke scent from a certain wood called Leia. A tense excitement gripped us. We glimpsed a hunter furtively hiding behind a tree. Contrary to what we expected, the children who came up to us did so without fear and with a certain discipline. They uttered little shouts of greeting, but their faces were earnest and unsmiling. An Indian came from one side and, taking the bridles of our mounts, led us into the center of the village before we were surrounded by a score of warriors. I was able to make a quick assessment of the layout. It comprised 6 palm leaf huts, ogival in shape, with an opening which served as a door, arranged in a semicircle. The savants waited expectantly to hear what we should say. Most of them were naked, wearing only a small hood-like covering made of woven vegetable fiber over the genitals. As adornment, they wore a plaited cotton necklace and a feather at the nape of the neck, a belt of the same material, and bands around their wrists and ankles. Some were painted red all over, except on their calves, which were decorated with vertical black stripes. Many wore tiny short pants, and some long pants. None of them had bows or spears. While Norma smiled broadly, I said in a few words that I had come because I wished to meet such fine warriors. When they heard me talk in their own dialect, the circle broke up, and incipient surprise gave place to smiles, but these vanished as if by magic when their chief approached. As he stared at me with his bright eyes, I doubted my sanity in having brought Norma to his village. They were cruel and calculating, and said what his smile was endeavoring to conceal. He wore no earrings like the warriors, and his jet-black hair was bound with a white headband. He had on a long-sleeved white shirt, white pants, and small boots known as sertaneras, named after the settlers of the wild Brazilian interior who wore the same style. On the third finger of his left hand was a gold wedding ring. The conversation we carried on in broken Portuguese, he speaking first. No Mireles, Francisco Mireles, as already mentioned, was the peacemaker. Both the settlers and the natives had been expecting him for months, and the former so that he should remove the savants, and the latter because of the presents they would receive. This officer had been introduced to me in Rio by the director of the Service for Protection of the Indian, Dr. Cabral Mata. Not no, come like friend, I replied. No good, we want Mireles. He come, and putting his hands together, he made a sound with his mouth like the noise of an aeroplane engine. He come, I answered, for Mireles himself had assured me that he would. You bring presents, bring friendship. No good, you bring oil, and the perfumed brilliantine to rub into the hair, for which he had a particular fancy. He had noticed that the settlers used it when they dressed up. His weakness was that he liked to look as much like the white man as possible, probably because he had been banished from his tribe. He made a sound with his tongue against his palate, which indicated his disapproval. What you bring? He demanded, fixing his eyes on the knapsack that Norma had on her saddle, and added, all ira buena, and advancing resolutely, he tugged at the bag. I confessed that I did not know what to do, and just as I was about to intervene, Norma gave him a slap on the wrist, which made him take his hand away. He looked at us disgustedly, and repeated ill-humoredly, all ira buena. Then he made a clicking sound with his mouth and went into his hut. The Indians surrounding us followed the chief's example, and we were left standing in the middle of the village. My wife showed evident signs of agitation, which I earnestly attributed to the dangerous situation we had created. Therefore, when she said to me indignantly, her cheeks flushing, who does he think he is? I began to feel better, and to sum up Irabuena calmly, I was surprised to find myself feeling sorry for him as I realized what he had lost by leaving his parent village and being obliged to depend on the white man. The minutes went by, and the atmosphere remained tense. I really was afraid that I should see an archer taking aim at us. For a moment I wondered whether it was we who were predestined to be the initiators of the storm of violence that had been expected. I said to my wife, if we are going to stay here, we'll have to get off these horses. Do you feel able to? Sure, was her prompt reply. Do you think I'm afraid of a fellow who ill-treats women?" It had been related to Savantina that in a fit of bad temper Yerbuena had struck one of his wives in the chest with a spear, and one of the women we had seen did have a frightful open wound at the top of one of her breasts. I got off my horse with considerable misgiving, with a naturalness which we did not feel. We advanced towards the hut that the chief had entered and crossed the narrow threshold. Small holes at ground level let in sufficient light inside the hut were 15 occupants, women who were in a majority, and men. The warriors were in an indolent attitude, half reclining on palm fiber mats. The chief, who did not follow the customs of his tribe, was rocking himself in a hammock. 3 warriors were at his side, carelessly fencing with heavy spears. When he saw us come in, he turned his face away. I went up to one of the warriors and praised the workmanship of some arrows he was feathering, and gave him a comb and a mirror. The fellow at once offered me 2 arrows. Influenced by an independence we had not expected to see, we sat down on a dry tree trunk which had been brought in for the fire, ready to withdraw as soon as the hint was given. The chief came up to us with great dignity and placed himself between Norma and me. He had 2 magnificent hollowed-out musical gourds, adorned with feathers, and the string which held them together was threaded through a small pastel-shaped shade bead of some shiny substance, possibly of animal origin, perhaps from a bird. When I tried to take them in my hands to have a better look at them, he stopped me and said, "Tomorrow you bring oil." "Tomorrow oil," I answered. "Tomorrow give." And rising he went away very pompously, and lay down once more in his hammock. That was the beginning of a friendship, not of the most loyal perhaps, but certainly one that was to prove interesting and very instructive to me. When we were leaving the village, we noticed that the tails of the 2 nags had been cut off. The children greatly esteemed horsehair for making fishing lines with as the next best thing to nylon. Modern civilization was reaching the erstwhile savage so fast that now he was spurning ordinary fishing lines and demanding synthetic ones.